How does one of the most beautiful resort towns on Earth vanish almost overnight, without fires, without ruins, without a single farewell? Imagine waking up in a place where the sea is impossibly blue. Hotel balconies face endless beaches, and the sound of suitcases rolling across marble floors fills the morning air. Varosha was not just another seaside destination. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was the crown jewel of Mediterranean luxury. Celebrities slept behind its glass facades. International jet-setters filled its nightclubs. Tourists believed they had found permanence disguised as paradise, and that belief would soon betray them. On the morning everything stopped, Varosha did not look like a city on the edge of disappearance. There were no warning sirens echoing through the streets, no visible destruction, no burning buildings. Breakfast tables were still set inside hotels. Store mannequins stared outward through spotless glass. Cars remained parked where they had been left hours earlier. Yet within days, tens of thousands of people would be gone, and none would ever be allowed to return. What makes Varosha unsettling is not only that it was abandoned, but how. Entire families fled, believing they would come back within a week. Hotel staff locked doors, expecting to reopen soon. Shop owners left inventory behind, confident this was a temporary interruption. History would prove all of them catastrophically wrong. To understand the shock of that moment, you have to understand what Varosha represented. This was a city engineered for pleasure and optimism. Built rapidly after World War II, it embodied a post-war dream of prosperity, leisure, and stability. Concrete towers rose confidently along the coast, symbols of a future that felt secure. The town thrived on predictability, seasonal tourism, steady growth, and the illusion that politics could never reach the beach. But beneath the cocktails and sunbeds, something far more volatile was building. Tensions existed, yes, but they were distant, abstract, easy to ignore when the hotels were full and the money kept flowing. Tourists came for sunshine, not history. They trusted the calm surface of daily life. And Varosha, flawless on the outside, encouraged that trust. Then came the moment when normal life fractured. Streets emptied with unnatural speed. Doors were shut without knowing they would never open again. Children were rushed away, clutching toys that would remain untouched for decades. In less time than it takes a city to evacuate for a storm, Varosha transitioned from one of the most photographed holiday destinations in Europe to a silent, sealed-off zone. No official farewell was ever announced. No structured evacuation plan explained what was happening. People left with whatever they could carry, driven by fear, confusion, and rumors spreading faster than facts. The belief that "we'll be back soon" became the final shared thought of an entire community. What followed was unprecedented. Unlike cities destroyed by war or natural disaster, Varosha was left standing, perfectly intact, yet completely forbidden. Hotels remained upright. Streets stayed mapped. Rooms still held personal belongings, slowly decaying in place. Time did not explode the city, it imprisoned it. This is what makes Varosha different from every other abandoned place on Earth. It was not lost gradually. It was not ruined. It was erased administratively, politically, and psychologically, locked behind fences and frozen under guard. A resort town designed for movement, joy, and noise became one of the quietest places in Europe. And the silence was deliberate. For decades, Varosha would exist as a visible absence. You could stand nearby and see it. You could point to the hotels, the beachfront, the empty towers, but you could not enter. A living city turned into a controlled void, suspended between past and future, belonging to no one yet claimed by power. The day Varosha froze in time did not end its story. It began something far more disturbing, a long experiment in abandonment, memory, and unresolved conflict. Because the real mystery isn't just why people fled so quickly, it's why, after all these years, they were never allowed to come back. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and think about what you've just heard. A city built for beauty, pleasure, and certainty didn't collapse slowly. It was switched off. And stories like this only make sense when we truly engage with them, not just watch them pass by. If this story is already changing the way you see abandoned cities, leave a comment right now. Even a short one. Say what struck you the most so far. Was it the sudden silence, the frozen hotel rooms, or the idea that an entire city was sealed away while still standing? Writing it down helps fix the story in your mind, and it shows me you're really following the investigation. And if you're starting to realize that Varosha is more than just a ghost town, that it's a warning, a symbol, a political scar, make sure you support this kind of deep storytelling. Click like if you value understanding the full context behind these mysteries, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. These stories only work when we tell them completely. Because in the next part, we're going to rewind time, back to when Varosha wasn't silent, forbidden, or fenced off, but alive, glamorous, and growing faster than anyone imagined. Before Varosha became a forbidden zone, before fences cut it off from the world, it was the very definition of modern paradise. In the decades following World War II, this stretch of coastline in Cyprus transformed at an almost unbelievable speed. What had once been a quiet seaside area evolved into one of the most glamorous resort towns on the planet, a place engineered to sell an idea that peace, prosperity, and leisure were permanent. By the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, Varosha was booming. Concrete hotel towers rose along the shoreline, each one competing to offer a better view of the Mediterranean, a larger pool, a more lavish lobby. The architecture itself reflected confidence. Clean lines, expansive balconies, glass facades designed to erase the boundary between interior luxury and the open sea. This was not old Europe. This was the future, poured in reinforced concrete. Tourism became the town's heartbeat. Airlines added direct routes. Travel brochures promised sun-soaked certainty. Varosha was marketed not just as a destination, but as a lifestyle upgrade. You didn't simply visit, you arrived. International visitors flooded in from Britain, Scandinavia, the Middle East, and beyond. For many, Varosha represented a safe Mediterranean alternative to more politically volatile regions, a neutral playground where money spoke louder than borders. Celebrities reinforced the myth. Film stars, musicians, and global icons stayed in its hotels, their presence amplified by gossip columns and glossy magazines. Every photograph of a famous face on Varosha's beaches added another layer to its reputation. If the rich and famous were here, the thinking went, this place must be untouchable. Tourism feeds on belief, and belief was Varosha's most valuable export. The local economy reorganized itself around this dream. Shops sold imported fashion, restaurants offered international menus, nightclubs pulsed with music long after midnight. Employment was steady, incomes rose, and an entire generation grew up assuming this prosperity was the natural order of things. Children of hotel workers believed the city would always be full. Business owners reinvested profits with confidence. New construction never seemed to stop. What made Varosha especially seductive was its rhythm. Every season followed the same script: spring preparations, summer crowds, autumn profits, winter maintenance. Predictability created psychological safety, even political. Developments elsewhere on the island felt distant, abstract, something discussed in newspapers, not something that could disrupt beachfront hotels and fully booked rooms. Yet beneath this polished surface, the town was dangerously dependent on one fragile assumption: that stability was guaranteed. Varosha was a single-purpose city. Almost everything depended on tourism. Hotels, shops, transport, services, all interconnected, all vulnerable to sudden disruption. There was no backup identity, no diversified economic base. The city thrived because nothing went wrong. and nothing, people believed, ever would. That belief shaped behavior. Investors expanded aggressively. Hotels grew taller, closer, denser. The skyline filled rapidly, leaving little space for caution. Urban planning followed opportunity, not contingency. Varosha was built to maximize presence, not resilience. It assumed tomorrow would always look like today. This is where the story becomes quietly unsettling. The more successful Varosha became, the less prepared it was for any kind of shock. Its beauty masked structural vulnerability. Its luxury distracted from geopolitical reality. While tourists admired sunsets and infinity pools, deeper forces were shifting beyond the resort's controlled environment. The town's residents sensed none of this. Or if they did, they dismissed it. Life was too good to question. Varosha felt protected by its own success, as if economic importance alone could function as armor. And that illusion, more than any single political decision, set the stage for what was coming. Because when a city is built entirely around certainty, the moment uncertainty arrives, it has nothing to fall back on. Before Varosha froze in time, it soared. And that rise, intoxicating and absolute, made the fall not just sudden, but inevitable in a way no one wanted to see. When the dust settled, and the last footsteps faded, Varosha revealed something far more disturbing than ruins. It revealed normality, untouched, orderly, and completely abandoned. Unlike cities destroyed by bombs or swallowed by disasters, Varosha remained structurally whole. Buildings stood upright, streets stayed mapped, rooms waited exactly as they had been left, as if the people who lived there had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Inside the hotels, time stopped mid-gesture. Reception desks still faced the entrances. Room keys hung where guests had last dropped them. Curtains remained, half-drawn, frozen in the position chosen to block the afternoon sun. In some rooms, beds were made. In others, suitcases sat open on the floor, clothing folded halfway, travel plans interrupted without explanation. These were not the remnants of panic. They were the remnants of certainty. Storefronts told the same story. Mannequins stood behind pristine glass, dressed in fashions from the early 1970s, their poses unchanged for decades. Price tags remained in local currency, untouched by inflation or time. Shelves still held products meant for tourists who would never return. Sunscreen, souvenirs, postcards celebrating a city already erased. Cash registers were closed, as if business would resume tomorrow morning. Cars were left where they had been parked. Some angled hastily near curbs. Others lined hotel driveways or rested in shaded lots. Keys sometimes still inside. There were no signs of systematic evacuation, no organized removal of property, no attempt to preserve or salvage. What remained suggested something far more unsettling. People left quickly, but not in chaos. They left with the assumption of return. Personal belongings deepened the unease. Family photographs, children's toys, shoes neatly placed beside doors, kitchen cabinets still stocked, refrigerators unplugged and left to rot. Each object anchored the city to individual lives that were abruptly severed from place. This wasn't just an abandoned town. It was an interrupted one. What makes this absence powerful is scale. One abandoned apartment can be dismissed as misfortune. One abandoned building might suggest decline. But Varosha was an entire urban system paused mid-function. Thousands of lives removed simultaneously, leaving behind the physical evidence of routines, habits, and expectations. A city designed for constant turnover suddenly had none. Over time, nature began its quiet invasion. Salt air corroded railings. Humidity peeled paint from walls. Plants pushed through cracks in concrete. Yet even decay unfolded slowly, almost respectfully. For years, rooms remained recognizable. Wallpaper patterns still visible. Furniture outlines still sharp. The process of erasure stretched across decades, not days. This gradual decay created a new kind of horror. The longer Varosha stood untouched, the more it felt like a crime scene preserved indefinitely. Not for investigation, but for power. Because unlike most abandoned places, Varosha was not forgotten. It was watched. Guarded, sealed. Its emptiness was enforced. No former residents were allowed to retrieve their belongings. No families permitted to walk back through their old neighborhoods. The city's stillness became policy. Objects that should have been reclaimed became political artifacts. Every shoe, every chair, every hotel lobby became evidence of a life paused without consent. And this raises an uncomfortable question. Why preserve abandonment itself? Why allow a city to rot in full view rather than let its people return, rebuild, or even dismantle it? The objects left behind don't just tell us how Varosha ended, they expose how power chose memory over humanity. Varosha did not collapse into rubble. It was embalmed, and the longer it remained sealed, the more the city transformed from a resort into a symbol of loss, control, and unresolved history made visible through empty rooms and silent streets. At first glance, Varosha's disappearance seems to invite simple explanations. Cities vanish. For familiar reasons. Earthquakes flatten them. Floods poison the land. Economic collapse drains them slowly until no one is left. But Varosha fits none of these patterns. There was no tsunami, no firestorm, no gradual decline. The buildings didn't fail. The infrastructure didn't collapse. Life was not eroded over years. It was interrupted in days. That contradiction is where the unease begins. Official narratives tend to frame Varosha's abandonment as an unfortunate but straightforward consequence of conflict. A necessary evacuation, a temporary measure, an unavoidable side effect of war. Yet when you examine the details closely, that explanation starts to feel incomplete. Wars devastate cities, but they rarely preserve them intact and untouched for half a century. Mistakes are made in chaos, but policies that freeze time require intention. There was no natural disaster forcing people out. The land remained stable. The sea did not recede or advance. The soil was not contaminated. Even today, engineers confirm that much of Varosha's core infrastructure could have been restored decades ago. The city was not uninhabitable, it was inaccessible by design. So if it wasn't nature, was it simple human error? That theory suggests rushed decisions, poor planning, fear-driven overreaction. But error does not explain duration. A mistake might justify an evacuation lasting weeks or months, perhaps even a few years. It does not explain why generation after generation was denied access, why former residents were barred from retrieving personal belongings, why international resolutions acknowledging the issue were ignored without consequence. At some point, negligence turns into strategy. This is where speculation intensifies and where discomfort grows. Varosha became more valuable abandoned than alive. As a sealed zone, it functioned as leverage. As an empty city, it served as a bargaining chip. The frozen streets were not just streets. They were pressure, points in a geopolitical stalemate. Allowing life to return would have weakened a position. Keeping the city locked preserved control, and control leaves fingerprints. The military fencing, the warning signs, the patrols, the absolute prohibition on civilian access. These were not temporary measures maintained out of caution. They were maintained out of choice. Varosha wasn't protected from danger. It was protected as danger. Its emptiness used to signal power, consequence, and unresolved dominance. The most disturbing aspect is how normalized this became. Over time, the world adjusted, headlines faded. The sealed city became a curiosity rather than a crisis. Tourists photographed it from afar. Journalists called it a ghost town. The language softened. What was once a humanitarian issue slowly transformed into an aesthetic one. And when that happens, accountability dissolves. Because if Varosha had been destroyed, reconstruction would have followed. If it had flooded, recovery, plans would exist. But because it remained standing, intact yet forbidden, the urgency vanished. The city became suspended not just physically, but morally, caught between responsibility and indifference. This raises a final, uncomfortable question for this part of the story. Was Varosha abandoned because it had to be, or because leaving it empty served someone's interests better than letting life return? Think about that before answering. Long after Varosha was sealed, long after maps were redrawn and explanations simplified, there were still voices that refused to align with the official version of events. These voices did not appear in press releases or diplomatic summaries. They surfaced quietly, in interviews that went unpublished, in handwritten letters, in testimonies passed down within families who once called Varosha home. Former residents described the same unsettling detail again and again. There was no sense of finality when they left. No announcement of permanent evacuation. No instructions to abandon property. Many recall being told, directly or indirectly, that the displacement would be brief. A matter of days, perhaps weeks, enough time for tensions to cool, enough time for order to return. That expectation shaped everything. People locked doors instead of boarding them up. They left food in cupboards. They carried documents and cash, but not furniture, not photographs, not the physical pieces of a life you abandon only when you know you'll never come back. Witnesses insist this was not a desperate escape. It was a pause. Some recall seeing military personnel reassuring civilians as they fled, reinforcing the belief that Varosha would reopen. Others remember radio broadcasts filled with ambiguity, carefully avoiding language that suggested permanence. There was fear, yes, but not resignation. That came later. Years later, when it became clear that return was not coming, many of these witnesses tried to speak. They wrote appeals. They filed claims. They gave interviews to journalists willing to listen. What they encountered instead was silence. Their accounts didn't fit the clean narrative of necessity and inevitability. So they were sidelined. One recurring testimony is especially troubling. Multiple residents claim that in the immediate aftermath of evacuation, there were windows of opportunity, brief periods when controlled re-entry could have been allowed. The city was stable, infrastructure intact, fires extinguished. Yet, instead of facilitating return, access tightened, guards increased, rules hardened. Why close the door when reopening was still possible? Other witnesses point to selective access, maintenance teams, surveyors, officials, individuals allowed to enter under authority, while former residents were denied even supervised visits. This created a deep sense of injustice. Varosha was not dangerous, it was restricted. And restriction, unlike danger, is a choice. There are also testimonies that contradict timelines. Some residents claim looting occurred not during chaos but later, after the city was already sealed. Others describe valuables removed systematically, suggesting organized activity rather than random decay. These details are rarely acknowledged, yet they recur too consistently to ignore. What makes these accounts powerful is not that they reveal a single hidden truth, but that they fracture the official story. They show that Varosha's abandonment was not a clean break, but a series of decisions layered over time. Decisions that hardened gradually, quietly, without public scrutiny. Memory, in this case, became inconvenient. As decades passed, witnesses aged. Some died without ever seeing their homes again. Others watched their children grow up hearing stories about a city they could see but never touch. The longer Varosha stayed closed, the easier it became to dismiss these voices as emotional, biased, or irrelevant. But history is rarely written by those who lost the Most. The testimonies of Varosha's former residents don't offer closure. They offer friction. They resist the comfort of simplified explanations. And they force us to confront a possibility that is deeply uncomfortable, that the city's abandonment was not just the result of conflict, but of silence layered upon silence, until return became politically inconvenient. What happened after Varosha was emptied is, in many ways, more disturbing than the evacuation itself. Cities displaced by conflict are usually revisited, rebuilt, or at least partially reopened once the fighting subsides. Varosha followed a different path. Instead of recovery, it entered a new phase, one defined not by destruction, but by absolute prohibition. Almost immediately, the area was sealed. Barbed wire fences went up. Warning signs appeared. Armed patrols enforced a simple rule: no civilians allowed. Former residents were not given permits. International observers were restricted. Journalists could only photograph the city from a distance. Varosha became a place you could see clearly but never touch. This was not a temporary security measure that lingered by accident. The restrictions were renewed year after year, long after active hostilities had ended. Decades passed, governments changed, negotiations stalled and restarted, yet the city remained locked. Entire generations grew up knowing Varosha only as a forbidden silhouette behind fencing. Official explanations leaned heavily on security. The area was described as unstable, unsafe, or strategically sensitive. But these claims weakened over time. Engineers confirmed the buildings were largely sound. Environmental studies found no contamination. Other nearby areas reopened and redeveloped. Only Varosha remained frozen. The question became unavoidable. Security from what, exactly? The city posed no military threat. It sat empty, silent, decaying slowly under sun and salt air. Yet its isolation intensified rather than relaxed. Patrol routes became routine. Surveillance continued. The absence of life was carefully maintained, as if emptiness itself had become policy. International bodies took notice. Resolutions were passed calling for Varosha's return to its lawful inhabitants. Statements were issued urging compliance. But these words carried no enforcement, no deadlines, no consequences. Over time, even condemnation softened into repetition. Varosha turned into a familiar issue, acknowledged, but unresolved. Meanwhile, the city's closed status served a function. As long as Varosha remained sealed, it held symbolic weight. It represented leverage, a reminder of unfinished business, a pressure point preserved in concrete and glass. Allowing people back would have shifted the balance. Keeping the city empty maintained it. For former residents, this logic felt cruel. They were not denied entry because their homes were gone. They were denied entry because their homes still existed. Their intactness made them politically useful in a way ruins never could. The fences did more than block access. They transformed Varosha into a warning, a message visible from afar. This is what happens when conflicts remain unresolved. But the message came at a cost, one paid by people whose lives were put on hold indefinitely. Over time, the forbidden zone began to feel normalized. Tourists took photos from observation points. Guides referred to it casually as a ghost city. The language stripped away responsibility. Ghosts don't have owners. Ghosts don't demand restitution. Ghosts simply haunt. But Varosha was never a ghost. It was a city deliberately kept empty. And the longer that emptiness endured, the harder it became to justify reopening. Decay advanced. Buildings weakened. Time itself became the final barrier. What was once a political decision slowly transformed into a logistical excuse. The city was not just locked. It was left to age into irreversibility, and that raises a question that refuses to disappear. Was Varosha sealed to protect the future, or to ensure the past could never be restored? Once Varosha was sealed and the fences became permanent, the world reacted the way it often does to slow, unresolved tragedies, not with urgency, but with paperwork. Statements were issued, meetings were held, words like concern, regret, and condemnation appeared in carefully drafted resolutions. On paper, Varosha was acknowledged. In reality, it was quietly abandoned by diplomacy. International. Organizations recognized the problem early. They documented the forced displacement. They affirmed the rights of former residents. They even passed formal resolutions calling for the city to be returned to its lawful inhabitants. On record, the position seemed clear. Varosha should not remain empty. Its people should be allowed back. But recognition without enforcement is a hollow gesture. There were no deadlines attached to those resolutions, no penalties for non-compliance, no mechanisms to compel action. Each year that passed without change made the previous statements feel more symbolic than serious. Varosha became a recurring agenda item, mentioned, deferred, and moved past. As global priorities shifted, the city slipped further down the list of urgent concerns. New conflicts emerged. New crises demanded attention. Varosha, still standing and still empty, did not generate dramatic images of destruction. There were no explosions, no refugee camps, no mass casualties to reignite. Outrage. The silence was easier to tolerate because it was quiet. Diplomatic negotiations referenced Varosha often, but always conditionally. It became a bargaining chip, something to be discussed later, once larger political issues were resolved. And later stretched into decades. Every stalled negotiation reinforced the same pattern. Varosha would wait. For former residents, these unkept promises cut deeper than open hostility. Hope was repeatedly raised, then quietly withdrawn. Each announcement hinted at progress. Each negotiation suggested movement, and each time nothing changed. The city remained sealed. Time continued its slow erasure. What makes this silence especially troubling is how normalized it became. The world accepted Varosha's status as permanent limbo. A city without people became an accepted anomaly. Its existence challenged no one directly. It required no emergency response. It asked only for memory, and memory is easy to neglect when it demands accountability. Meanwhile, the longer the silence lasted, the easier it became to argue that reopening was no longer practical. Buildings deteriorated, infrastructure aged, nature advanced. What began as a political delay gradually turned into a technical justification. Too much time has passed, replaced, "This must be resolved." Silence in this case was not neutral. It actively reshaped reality. By failing to act, the international community allowed Varosha to drift from a solvable injustice into a historical inconvenience. A tragedy no longer measured by lives interrupted, but by decaying concrete and faded photographs. And that may be the most uncomfortable truth of all. Varosha did not remain empty because no one spoke. It remained empty because speaking was never followed by action. With no people allowed inside Varosha, something else slowly took their place. Not chaos, not fire, not demolition crews. Just time, quiet, patient, and relentless. What war did not destroy, nature, began to reclaim, step by step, season after season. At first, the changes were subtle. Salt air corroded metal railings along hotel balconies. Paint blistered under the Mediterranean sun. Window seals dried and cracked. These were the kinds of imperfections any coastal city fights daily with maintenance crews and fresh coats of paint. But Varosha had no crews, no repairs, no intervention. Small problems were allowed to grow. Then vegetation appeared. Weeds pushed through cracks in sidewalks. Grass crept into parking lots. Vines climbed facades once designed to impress tourists from above. Palm trees grew wild without pruning, their roots lifting pavement and fracturing foundations. What had been carefully curated luxury landscapes began dissolving into uncontrolled growth. Inside the buildings, humidity became the silent destroyer. Without climate control, moisture seeped into walls and ceilings. Wallpaper peeled away in long strips. Mold spread across plaster. Wooden furniture warped and collapsed under its own weight. Curtains disintegrated into fabric dust. Every room began to change, not dramatically, but irreversibly. What makes Varosha unique is how long this process remained visible. For decades, interiors were still recognizable. Hotel logos lingered above entrances. Swimming pools still held faint outlines beneath algae and debris. Elevators stood frozen between floors. The city decayed slowly enough to be observed, almost studied, like a long-term experiment. In abandonment, wildlife followed. Birds nested in open rooms. Insects colonized dark corridors. Turtles began laying eggs on beaches once packed with sunbeds and umbrellas. The shoreline, freed from constant human presence, started to recover in ways it never could during Varosha's peak years. Ironically, the absence of people restored parts of the natural ecosystem. This created a disturbing contrast. Inside the city, human spaces rotted. Outside, nature thrived. The luxury that once symbolized progress now looked fragile and temporary, while the natural world appeared patient and enduring. The longer Varosha stayed sealed, the clearer that contrast became. Over time, decay itself became a barrier. What could once have been reopened relatively easily now required massive restoration. Structural integrity weakened. Safety concerns increased. Each passing year made return less feasible, not because it was impossible, but because neglect had been allowed to accumulate. Deliberately. Nature did not destroy Varosha out of violence. It erased it gently, persistently, without urgency, and in doing so it provided a convenient excuse. Reopening, officials could now argue, would be dangerous. Too much decay, too much risk. Time had done the work politics could not. But here is the unsettling truth. Nature was never the cause. It was the alibi. Varosha's transformation into ruins was not inevitable. It was permitted. Every crumbling balcony and collapsing ceiling stands as proof of years of inaction layered on top of political choice. The city didn't just decay, it was allowed to decay. And once luxury turns to ruin, something else happens. The conversation shifts. People stop asking who should return and start asking whether return is even possible anymore. Here's the part that feels almost unreal. For decades, Varosha was treated like a sealed photograph, untouchable, unchangeable, frozen behind wire. Then, in more recent years, the idea of reopening, it began to surface again, not as a distant dream, but as an active political move. And the moment that happened, Varosha stopped being only a ghost town. It became a battleground of narratives. Because reopening Varosha isn't like reopening a museum. It isn't even like rebuilding a ruined neighborhood. It's a question of ownership, displacement, legality, and legitimacy, wrapped in concrete, beachfront property, and decades of unresolved pain. The city's silence wasn't just emptiness. It was a statement. And when you break that silence, you don't just change the future. You risk changing the past. Think about what reopening implies. If people walk those streets again, if hotels are renovated, if cafes reopen, if tourists return with cameras and beach towels, the story subtly shifts. The abandoned city becomes a revived city. The tragedy becomes a new chapter. And for the people who lost homes there, that can feel less like progress and more like erasure, like the world is moving on in a way that pretends the wound is healed simply because the scenery is useful again. Officially, reopening is often presented as something practical: economic development, tourism revenue, restoration, a return to life. But underneath that practical language, there's a deeper tension. Who gets to decide what return even means? Is it the return of the rightful residents, or the return of activity under a new political reality. Those are not the same thing. And in Varosha, the difference is everything. Here's the first twist people miss. The legal story has never been clean. Varosha sits inside a web of international law, UN resolutions, property claims, and human rights rulings. There are frameworks that recognize displaced owners, and frameworks that propose remedies that don't necessarily include going home. Compensation, exchange, claims processed through commissions, paper solutions to a physical loss. For some, that feels like justice. For others, it feels like a negotiation over a life that was never supposed to be negotiable. And once the conversation becomes legal paperwork, the emotional reality becomes easier to dismiss. A home becomes a file. A street becomes a case number. A childhood bedroom becomes property. Varosha isn't only an abandoned resort town, it's a reminder that displacement can be processed, categorized, and slowly normalized until the human side becomes background noise. Then came the second twist. Even limited access changes the psychology of the place. The moment parts of Varosha were opened, whether fully, partially, or symbolically, something irreversible happened. The world's relationship with Varosha shifted from forbidden to available. And availability invites a certain kind of amnesia. People stop asking, who lived here, and start asking, what can we do with it? The city becomes a project instead of a tragedy. You can see how quickly that shift happens in human behavior. Tourists want photos. Influencers want urban exploration content. Media outlets want dramatic visuals, empty hotels, crumbling balconies, a beach reclaimed by time. The story becomes aesthetic. And once a story becomes aesthetic, it becomes easier to consume than to confront. But Varosha is not neutral ground. Every step inside carries a political shadow. Every restoration decision becomes a statement. Which buildings get cleaned first? Which streets get reopened? Which areas remain restricted? These aren't just urban planning questions. They signal control. And control, in a place like Varosha, is the entire reason the city became a symbol in the first place. Now imagine how this feels to someone displaced in 1974. You don't just lose your home, you lose your timeline. You spend years believing return is possible, then decades realizing it's blocked. Then suddenly you see images of people walking near your old neighborhood, while you still can't truly reclaim it. That emotional contradiction can harden into something sharper than grief. It becomes a fear that history is being rewritten in real time, with new visitors acting like the city was abandoned in the casual sense, rather than taken away through conflict. And that fear has consequences. It intensifies political resistance. It escalates language. It raises the stakes for negotiations that were already fragile. Because once Varosha begins to change physically, it becomes harder to argue for restoring the original reality. Time doesn't just decay buildings, it changes bargaining positions. And the longer reopening moves forward, the more it can feel like the world is accepting a new version of the truth. So, Varosha stands at a dangerous intersection. Reopening can be framed as hope, but it can also function as a quiet form of closure imposed from above. Not closure as healing, closure as finality. And that's why this phase of the story is so tense. It's not only about whether Varosha will live again, it's about whose version of Varosha will survive. Half a century after it was emptied, Varosha still stands. Its skyline fractured, its beaches silent, its windows reflecting a past that refuses to die. But Varosha is no longer only about Cyprus, politics, or property. It has become something larger, a mirror held up to the world, showing what happens when beauty, power, and denial coexist too long in the same place. Varosha's story forces us to confront a paradox. It is a ruin of prosperity, a monument to paralysis. It stands untouched, Not because people forgot about it, but because too many remembered it in ways that benefited them. For some, it became a bargaining chip. For others, a symbol of injustice. For many outsiders, simply an aesthetic curiosity, a haunting postcard from the 1970s, preserved by conflict and sun. But what makes Varosha unforgettable is how it distills the fragility of civilization itself. One generation builds paradise, the next watches it decay behind fences. The same hotels that once embodied optimism now stand as relics of human arrogance, the belief that progress is permanent, that wealth guarantees stability, that politics can be kept outside the gates of leisure. Varosha proves how easily paradise can become evidence. Every abandoned balcony carries a question. How many other places in the world live under similar illusions today? Cities that believe themselves safe because they are rich. Societies convinced their comfort is immune to history. Varosha whispers that no structure, economic, political, or emotional, is truly untouchable. And yet, its endurance gives it a strange kind of power. The fences could not erase memory. They preserved it. The silence became louder than propaganda. Decay turned into testimony. What was meant to be buried became proof that no narrative, however carefully controlled, can outlast time itself. Standing at the edge of Varosha today, you can feel that contradiction in the air, the beauty of the landscape against the weight of its absence. The wind carries traces of salt, dust, and memory. It feels like the city breathes, slowly, unwilling to die completely. It is not alive, but it is not gone. It exists in a suspended state between history and warning. And perhaps that's why the story of Varosha continues to resonate far beyond its physical borders. Because it is not just about displacement. It is about how humans handle loss, whether they choose to repair, to forget, or to use memory as leverage. Varosha exposes the uncomfortable truth that forgetting can be as deliberate as conflict. It reminds us that history is not only written by those who win, but also by those who maintain silence long enough for others to stop asking questions. Maybe the real tragedy of Varosha is not that it was abandoned, but that it became acceptable for it to stay that way. Its emptiness was institutionalized, its suffering archived. The world moved on, calling it frozen in time, as if time itself were responsible, rather than policy, profit, and pride. And yet, as long as Varosha stands, it refuses to fully disappear. Every grain of sand on its beach, every broken door and rusted car, every photograph taken through a fence, is a quiet accusation, a reminder that neglect is not the same as peace. If you've made it this far, it means the story reached you. So now, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "I remember Varosha," to keep this city's memory alive. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that uncover the beauty, loss, and truth hidden behind silence, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and watch the next story appearing on your screen right now. Because the past is never really gone. It's just waiting for someone to look closer.